Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
There was an old BT advert that said, "It's good to talk." And generally, we all know it's good to talk. We know that in business, it's good to have good relationships with your colleagues. But for some reason, when it comes to landlord and tenant, that communication sometimes falls apart. So when was the last time that you spoke to your tenant? And if you have an agent, I guess that doesn't really matter that much. But if you're self-managing, that could be disastrous. This week on Your Lettings Journey, we're talking communication. So it's good to talk. And today we're going to go through the who, what, why, where, when, and how of communication, or of landlord-tenant communication. So Romesh, why is it important for there to be good communication between landlord and tenant?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a second, Rachel, but on a really serious note, I don't know if you heard about the elderly man who lay dead in his flat, undiscovered for 6 years. Obviously really sad and disturbing. He was sort of left for 6 years and had some communication from the Housing Association, simply letters, it seems. This is a classic example of how communication can be lacking. But yeah, going back to your question, Rachel, communication is absolutely critical for landlords to have a good relationship with their tenant. You're going to have a much higher chance of having a happier, longer lasting tenancy if you have good communication. It's not just about the rent rolling in.
I think the example you've given there is a perfect reason, or a perfect example of why communication is important, why having good communication with your tenant is crucial, because clearly that situation is not something that should have happened. And if there had been good communication, it wouldn't have happened. And all too often I speak to landlords who are managing their own properties, and it turns out that they don't visit them, that there is a sort of a feeling that, well, if there's something wrong, the tenant will contact me. They will let me know that there's something wrong, and then I will go around and see it, or, then somebody else will go around. So I had a checkout the other day for a self-managing landlord, and we had put the tenant in place 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. And as we were doing the checkout and going around, I said, okay, so how is everything going? Have you enjoyed living here? How did you get on with your landlord? And turned out that he hadn't seen him since February 21. And I just thought, wow, that's not good, And it's that kind of thing that for me is the why.
Yeah,
basically.
Absolutely.
So having said why, when do you want to start with when? Where would you like to start with, Romesh?
Maybe how.
Okay, so I'm a landlord. How should I be communicating with my tenant?
Well, there's lots and lots of different ways you can do it. So, the choice is numerous, really. The obvious way is in person, by carrying out home visits, inspections, and going and seeing your tenant on a regular basis. Obviously phone, text, WhatsApp, there's, so many different methods we can use. Obviously mobile numbers need to be given from the outset in order to deal with emergencies, because you need to be contactable out of office hours or evenings, weekends, etc. And if you're going to be away, think about having a next of kin, a backup number available, so your tenant can still get hold of you or someone on your behalf. But equally, I think it's also important to outline your preference, how you would like to be communicated, with, because obviously you don't want to do it just on the tenant's terms. You want to do it on your terms as well, if at all possible. So ideally, agree on a method that both parties are comfortable with. If there's an issue that needs to be communicated, that how that will be done, assuming we're not talking about a visit and inspection. Got to bear in mind that the age of landlords is different to the age of tenants, more often than not. So the landlord profile tends to be somewhat older than average tenant profile, which I think is in your 30s. So factor in that some landlords can't deal with certain levels of tech. Having said that, my in-laws, they can do text, WhatsApp, and they're in their 70s and they have no problem whatsoever. So credit to them. They're maybe one of the more modern, older landlords, so to speak. And I think you also need to think, are you going to have an open door policy, when you communicate with your tenant? Are you going to field calls from them left, right and centre whenever it is they choose? Or are you going to try and train them and explain to them, look, these are the times when it's best to contact me because I'm at work during the day, unless it's an emergency or whatever. Ping me a text or a WhatsApp or an email even. I think one thing that's important to do also is follow up any contact you have via phone or verbal contact, follow it up with a text or a WhatsApp. So there's a record which outlines what was discussed, what was agreed. So it reduces opportunities for misunderstandings, I think. And lastly, I would say when you're communicating with your tenants, communicate with patience, empathy and care. It's a long-term business relationship at the end of the day. You don't want to be emotional and knee-jerk reactions, which can damage the relationship. What do you think, Rachel?
I think you covered a whole lot of stuff in that one. I think it kind of goes back to the basics and the need to plan all of this out before you actually start your tenancy, number one. And I think the how very much depends on the stage of the tenancy. So if you are a self-managing landlord and you found your own tenant, then you will have had some communication with your tenant before they actually move in. And so that relationship has, to some extent, already started. If you have used an agent to find your tenant, but you're still self-managing, then the first thing I would say is that how needs to be an in-person meeting before that tenant actually moves in, so that you've started that relationship, so that you can actually see the person and ideally have some say about them actually moving in, and so that they can see you as well, because of course it is a two-way relationship. Once you've actually put that face and met somebody, then you can decide on how you're going to communicate from that point on. But yes, I would agree with you completely that you need to work out how do you want to be communicated with and what are your boundaries. So for me, there's three key things. There's the tone of your relationship, which should always be professional but friendly. There is the method of communication. And then there are the boundaries that you're going to set. So when you say open door policy, I kind of start to panic slightly, as you know, because I don't want to receive WhatsApps at 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm sure most landlords don't, unless it's an emergency, obviously. So I think in terms of the how, yes, the average or the median average age of landlords is, I think, 58, 59, whereas the average age of tenants is 32. And the 16 to 34-year-olds is the biggest group of tenants, but there's a third of landlords who are over retirement age. So getting that communication right, including the method, is really, really important. But it's got to work for both parties, as you say. And then the boundaries, you've got to set those early. I think the dangers of having an open door policy from day one is that people do think that they can call you at all hours of the day and night to say that the washing machine has broken. And nobody wants a call on Christmas Day to say, hey, my washing machine's broken. It's like, there's nothing I can do about it now. That does not constitute an emergency. But you do want them to be able to feel comfortable that they can call you about, the fact that the boiler's not working over the weekend. So yes, I would agree. The how is really important. Get that set out early. And so that then leads us on to the what? Do you want to go to what next?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. So it's well, we worked out how, but what actually are we going to be communicating with our tenants? And I think that's a really, really key thing to plan, really. So, Rachel, tell me, what are we going to be communicating with our tenants?
Okay. I thought you were answering that one. Okay, all right. What are we communicating? Again, that depends on where you are in the tenancy. So for me, one of the most important things is the move-in day, the check-in. I think that's a really important point in time for the landlord and the tenant to get together, spend some time together, look around the property. Landlord can point out any sort of little idiosyncrasies about a property, and they can, stress how you can work the boiler, give them all of the details that you talked about already in terms of phone numbers, who to contact in emergencies, times, all that sort of thing. The stuff that you might need for a license, so information about when the bins go out, how to I was going to say fire escapes. I suppose you do if it's a flat, but not so much so if it's a house. So all that sort of thing can be done face to face, giving your tenant manuals for all the appliances, letting them know if there's any kind of insurance package in place if an appliance fails, which will cut down the number of calls to you for maintenance. And yeah, it's just a chance to touch base and to say, I care about my property. I care about you living in my property, and to set a tone. Some people will buy their tenant a card at that point, welcome to your new house. They might buy them some essentials, a bottle of wine, box of chocolates, that kind of thing, just to say, I value you as a tenant and I care about my property, which is always really nice. That personal touch is always really nice. And then as you go through the tenancy, there's different things you want to communicate. So you need to be very clear about how you're going to communicate if work needs to be done, and if that's the sort of standard legal stuff. So gas certificates, if you need to have an electrical certificate done at any point, if there's any basic maintenance that needs to be done, who's going to contact the tenant and how are they going to do it. So generally, we would say, if you let me know that there's a plumbing issue, for example, I will get the plumber to contact you to arrange to go around and do things when you're there. You also want to make sure that you schedule in your inspections. So letting them know in advance that, yes, there's going to be inspections. Yes, I'm going to come around and see you. And we're going to talk about any issues with the property, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if you have that kind of regular communication and you set it out from the beginning, then the tenants know what to expect. And so that that leads to a good relationship. But at the same time, if you have a bad tenant, someone who is perhaps planning to do things that they shouldn't be doing in your property, maybe they're growing things, or maybe they just want to sublet the odd room. If you point out very clearly, I am going to be coming round, I am going to come and see this property every quarter, or every 6 months, or what have you, then there's no kind of disputing it. You're setting that tone from the very beginning. And it's always easier to do these things at the beginning rather than to do them at the end, or to do them halfway through. So that for me is the sort of what it's keeping up with the legal stuff, keeping up with the inspections, and setting the tone to say, look, I value you and I want you as a tenant in my property. Sure. Have I missed anything there?
I was just thinking about what you... No, but I was just thinking about what you said then. I thought when you do those regular inspections after the initial check-in, I think you're going to get a clue as to the type of tenant you've actually got, and the relationship you're going to have with the way that they sort of react and interact. And I just thought it might give you an early sign if you've got a potentially troublesome tenant, or a tenant that's going to give you a headache, or become a problematic in the future, really.
The actual inspection.
When you do those initial visits, once you start to do those initial visits and you say, I'm going to be coming after 2 or 3 months, the way that they react and respond, because sometimes you'll get tenants who'll say, yes, oh, no, you don't need to come round. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. And you sort of worry, well, why wouldn't you want me to come round? What have you got to hide almost? Do you know what I mean?
Well, no, absolutely. And, for me, when you say it at the welcome, that I'm going to come around and I'm going to visit, and it's going to be every 3 months. And you need to make sure that it's not just, hey, I'm going to keep popping round, or I'll drop in when I'm driving by. That's not good communication. That's stepping over the mark. And that was actually one of the things that I saw on the Tenant's Voice. So I was looking on the Tenant's Voice, which is a online tenant communication and advice type thing. Very technical this morning. And they were saying basically make sure, their actual words were, renting is a transaction, not a relationship. And you do yourself no favours if you forget that. And they're very kind of black and white, but they were basically saying, your landlord is not your best friend. No matter how well you're getting on, it's a business relationship. They're not your best friend. And the last thing you want to do is to say to your landlord, oh, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, just pop in when you're passing, because once, they're saying once that happens, give an inch, take a mile. And it's the same from both sides, really. So you need to set the stall up front. I am going to be coming around every 3 months. It's not just to have a general chat, although we will try and keep it friendly. It's to actually make sure that A, you're okay, and B, you're treating my property all right. Sure. But the welcome is the reinforcement of that, because that's something for me that you want to have said before you sign the contract. It's something you want to highlight in the contract to say there are inspections. I will be coming round. You'll say it when you do the initial viewing. Before you sign them up, you'll do it at the point of going through the contract, and then you reiterate it at the welcome stage, because you don't want that tenant to be thinking, oh goodness, I was planning on subletting the room, so actually from this point on I'm not going to let you into this property, because they've already signed a contract at that point. So you don't want that. You want to be putting them off. If they have that in mind, you want to be putting them off before they're actually in the property.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, there's some other things that you might communicate while with your tenant. I guess changes that happen with their life, whether they're having an extra child, or if they're having personal issues, divorce or whatever. So these things will come up during the course of your communication and have an impact, obviously, on the tenancy, because you think, well, if they're having a divorce, then who's going to be left? Are they going to be able to cope with the rent? And is the property still suitable for them? And I think we discussed this before, and you said, if you go to your flat and you discover your tenants, expecting having another child, and obviously they're going to start to struggle in terms of space as well. So other kind of
you all heart there, Romesh. You all. I want to know if they're getting divorced, and I want to know if they're having another baby and overcrowded. They're loving the empathy today.
Very important things to know about.
It is very important. You're absolutely right. I think I can't disagree with you. The idea of having that regular interaction with people is so that if anything happens, they feel comfortable talking to you. So we spoke previously about whether people feel comfortable raising the issue of repairs, or whether they think that raising repairs is going to mean that the rent is going to go up, or they're going to be asked to leave. And so you want to make sure that you have that decent relationship, so that they know that actually I'm valued here as a tenant. And if I raise an issue, it's going to be sorted, and it's going to be sorted in decent time. And similarly, if somebody says, oh, I think I'm going to be made redundant, you want them to be able to discuss that with you, because it's nice and it takes pressure off them, but also it means that you can plan and you can perhaps discuss strategies with them. So if somebody comes along and says, actually, I'm about to get divorced, as you say, I'm about to get divorced. I'm not working. I've got 2 kids. I don't know, he's not going to support me going forward. I don't know what I'm going to do about the rent. And then you as a landlord can help advise them about going to perhaps the council, or, applying for universal credit and that sort of thing. So in a way, you're protecting yourself there, but you're also showing, you want to be approachable to your tenants so that it takes some stress off them and they can focus on what they actually need to do. But as you say, similarly from the landlord's point of view.
But also, Rich, I was going to say, often, sometimes tenants, if they feel that there isn't that level of communication and trust, they will sort of bury their head in the sand and sort of not communicate and struggle. And then that's obviously your worst case scenario, because then things are going to go to breakdown because they won't communicate and they're not able to pay the rent, and they just sort of get into a vicious
exactly.
cycle.
That's what I mean. That's why you.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm saying. You want them to tell you so that you can help. So you've got to have that relationship. Yeah. And then similarly, when it comes down to your life as landlord, we have a landlord who, because of all the mortgage increases at the moment, he's in a position where his mortgage has doubled. His rent hasn't, and it's not possible for his rent to double. And so financially, he can't carry on. And so he said, unfortunately, I do need to serve notice on my tenants. But we kind of agreed with him that we will let the tenants know. We're going to do a visit. We'll let the tenants know. We won't be serving them notice straight away, because they don't need that immediate stress and strain, we are fairly confident that they will be able to find someplace else to move to. So we've agreed with the landlord that we're going to give them a month of just, letting you know verbally that actually your landlord is going to be serving notice. And then in a month's time, at that point, then we will serve notice. So it's giving them, having that relationship to be able to give them that advance notice, that things are not as they should be. If you like. But yeah, I mean, from a landlord's point of view, you could also be saying, we have had one landlord who's sort of like, my relationship is not great at the moment. And there's every chance I might need to move back in. So it works both ways. You want to know about your tenant situation, but also for a tenant to have to pack up their entire lives if they've lived somewhere for 3, 4, 5 years. You want to be able to give them warning without scaring them unnecessarily. Yeah. Just like a bit of warning that, something might happen, rather than dropping it on them just before they go on holiday and saying, hey, you've got 2 months, but you're going to be on holiday for 3 weeks of that. Then you've got 5 weeks when you come back. Yeah. So, you want to,
No, I agree. Okay.
That's good news, isn't it? Yes. Divorce and I need you to leave.
Let's move on then. Okay. So, I mean, this one's probably quite a short couple of questions, really, moving on. When and where will I have communication? I think we touched upon some of this already. So obviously it's going to be your initial meeting, those visits, those inspections, when you have unplanned repairs arising, emergencies arising, out of office hours, evenings, weekends. So that kind of question really is, we've covered many parts of it. Did you want to add anything on that, Rachel?
Yeah, I don't know about the when and where, because I think that's fairly straightforward. The when for me is just making sure that you do have regular communication and that it's timely. Really, I think one of the things we've missed out is the who, because quite often on a contract, I mean, basically you always have to have somebody that you're going to be communicating with. It's good to have that key point. So when you register a deposit, there is the lead tenant. When you're signing a contract, there is the first tenant, there is a second tenant. So to know who you're communicating with and who's then communicating with you is also quite crucial. And to work out for what things, because quite often while you might be talking to one person about the maintenance of the property and arranging contractor visits and, inspections even, inspections. If you're talking about the rent or arrears or anything financial like that, you may well be talking to a different person. So get that sorted out at the beginning. And then the other thing, I think you mentioned it very quickly at the beginning, was about the how do you communicate. So I'm a big one in the professional and friendly type communication. So yes, I would say that for the majority of things, you want to be doing it ideally on the phone. It's quite nice to have a bit of casual chit chat, and it's easier to understand people when you're doing it when you're communicating face to face or on the phone. If you do things via text or WhatsApp, the sentences are very short. There's text speak, there's abbreviations, there's all sorts of fancy youth speak that I don't get, and possibly a lot of landlords don't get. And if you do things by email, then the tone can be misinterpreted. So yes, I would say the majority of things, ideally, you want to just do over the phone, potentially. You can, as you say, follow them up with an email just to say, really nice talking to you earlier on today, as discussed, blah, 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 blah. But there are certain things that you do want to put in writing. So if you're struggling to get hold of your tenant because you need to carry out a gas certificate or any other legally compliant thing, or to do an inspection or anything like that, then yes, you want to put that in writing and you want to keep writing on a regular basis. If you're serving notice, then that's something that you want to do in writing. But you also need to check that on your contract, that if you're sending an email, that email is actually a valid way of giving notice. Because if it's not, then your notice is completely invalid. So double check what it says on your contract, because it may mean that you have to actually physically put a letter in the post to the tenant. But I think that was one of the things that went wrong with the gentleman that died, was that the housing provider had covered their back by sending lots of letters, but they hadn't done the informal touch points beforehand, and they hadn't then reacted to the fact that they didn't have, that they weren't getting hold of anybody. They didn't then react and say, oh, something might be wrong with this retired gentleman that we haven't contacted or we haven't spoken to for years. So that was all very,
I think
very
it was
sad.
I think it was just a name on a list, and they've just ticked that they've made their standard form of contact and no further effort made, really. But it's sad that society we've allowed this gentleman to pass away, and just slipped through the net, so to speak.
I think it's very difficult when you work for a big organisation, and as I understand it, this was one of the big housing associations, because everyone has a specific. I mean, you've worked in public sector, I've worked in public sector. It can get very bureaucratic, and everyone has a very defined role and tasks, specific tasks that they're responsible for, and sometimes there just isn't that joined up thinking. So that shouldn't happen with a standard landlord. But as you say, sometimes if you're getting the rent in and you're not hearing anything, you just think, yay, happy days, no problem. I would just think that's 6 years is a bit extreme if you are an individual landlord and it's your property.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Were there any other things that we didn't cover there? I think one of the key things that we didn't cover is, we've talked about the nice side of talking to people. We've touched a bit on the legal side of the things you actually have to do. And I think that's one of the big things that you do need to communicate with tenants, is that you are keeping on top of the legal side of things. Because I think there's a lot more awareness from tenants. There is a lot more. There's things like the tenant's voice, there's shelter, and all those sorts of things. And landlords should be up on everything that they're telling to everything they legally need to do. And a lot of things like licenses. I think the licensing terms, if I remember correctly, in Enfield say that you actually have to inspect every 6 months. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you've done that. You need to be able to demonstrate you've been around to your property should the council ever investigate. So there is a legal compliance side to that. And for a lot of things, the number of landlords that I speak to, a couple of landlords recently, where we put tenants in a long time ago, and they're now wanted us to relet their properties. And you say, okay, well, can you send me your gas cert, your electrical certificate, and your selective license, information on your license? And neither of them knew what a selective license was. And for those sorts of things, with the legislation changing as it is, we've got the renters reform and everything coming along soon. You think, well, people need to really be up on what is happening. You need to be up on what's happening. And that takes time. And I was reading about the percentages of landlords recently, and it was like 4% of landlords actually list property as their business. So 96% of landlords have something else as their main business. Now, I think 35% or something, 35% were retired. So maybe golf. Yeah. Golf is their key business.
Yeah.
But it was just a really small number. So if you have a full-time job, or you have a family and you have a part-time job, or anything like that, then keeping up to date with the ever-changing laws is quite an ask, really.
It's a challenge. It is a challenge.
It is. It's not the actual going round and talking to your, or visiting your tenant or phoning up your tenant every now and again. It's not that's the problem. It's the keeping up to date with all of the things that you need to be doing, and then communicating those back to the tenant. Making sure they have a copy of the gas certificate, and that, making sure they have a copy of the license, all that sort of thing. It's just that takes time, and so it's making people aware that you can't just give people a property and sit back and have the money rolling in.
Okay, I think you've sort of brought us to a really interesting point now, actually, Rachel. So what if you've got a self-managing landlord, and having listened to this podcast, they'll be thinking, gosh, I've got to do all this communication with my tenants. What if they turn around and just say, I just don't think I have the time?
Yeah, as I say, the communication in itself isn't really the issue. It's not the going around and doing a visit on most people. So most landlords have just one or two properties. 40% have just one property. So actually going and visiting that one property every quarter or every 6 months isn't that time consuming. It's not. It's the keeping up to date on the ever changing laws, making sure that, if one tenant moves out, so if they do get divorced, apart from the fact that you've been very empathetic and sorted out the housing benefit and everything, have you also changed the deposit? Did you know that you need to change the deposit? It's those little things that take time to actually investigate. So communication, not so much so. Keeping legal does take time. And there are bodies and membership schemes that you can join to help with this. So you can ask them questions, you can read regular updates. So the NRLA, National Resident Landlord Association, they're the biggest, I think. But again, only is it 20% of landlords are or have had membership of a body like NRLA, which is staggering. 4% only have it as a business, and 20% have had membership.
And
need to find the
they
time.
do have they have a legal and helpline, free legal helpline. So you there's a resource there that you can get, which isn't actually that expensive to be a member of NRLA. I think it's £75 or £100 a year. So,
I don't know
but
about
I think the key point is,
probably.
I think the key point is, do you have the time? And if you don't have the time, then you need to think about looking at alternative routes and ways to try to get help to manage this side of things in terms of your communication and dealing with your tenant.
Yeah. And as I say, again, it's the legal bit, not the communication. But join become a member of XYZ. There are lots of forums as well for landlords that you can join. There are Facebook groups, there are LinkedIn groups, places where you can, and any kind of legal helpline. We have a legal helpline. I think it's amazing. You just phone up with the most ridiculous of questions just because you start panicking about something, or something that is really random happens. Because 9 times out of 10, your tenancy is going to be super smooth. You could be one of the many people who doesn't go around and visit your property for 3, 4 years. You send around contractors, but you don't actually visit it yourself for 3 or 4 years, and there's no problem whatsoever. Or you could be like a friend of mine who rented a property to a friend of his. It was all very casual, all very, we're mates. I've got a house. You need a house. Very low rent. And my friend thought that it was all just very casual. You pay me a certain amount of rent, I leave you, you get on with the house. And it was a small rent. So any maintenance, I don't want to know about it really. You do it all yourself. And it came to a point where the tenant had lost his job and had stopped paying rent. And initially they were chatting and it was all very friendly and, okay, I'm not going to pressure you. I understand you're in a tough situation, etc., etc. But then it gets to a point where actually I've still got a mortgage on this place and you're not paying me any rent and this is a bit of an issue. And at that point, the tenant started making a few mutterings about, well, where have my gas certificates been for the past 9 years? And then you think, actually, I've made a mistake. I can't just sit back. I need to make sure that this property is legal. So even if you are letting to a friend or a family member and you're finding it awkward to do the formal stuff, I would say go find an agent and get the basics done. Get a contract in place, get all your deregulation documents sorted, get it done legally to start with, and then rent to your friend. But never just assume that families and friends are going to be great. It quite often goes the wrong way.
No, I think very, very sound advice, Rachel. So if we have a quick summary, what would your absolute top tips in 30 seconds be?
Communication is, you should have good communication in any business relationship, and landlord-tenant is another business relationship. If you have a standard tenancy, then it won't make that much difference whether there is great communication or not. But if you have a tenancy that goes wrong, either for unforeseen reasons or because you just have a bad tenant, then the fact that you don't have or that you haven't had that communication could make a bad situation even worse. Particularly, as I say, it's the legal stuff, not necessarily the comms, that takes the time and effort. So, yeah, be careful, because if it goes bad, it goes bad.
Okay, no good. I was just going to sort of sum up and say, landlords, tenants, very much a people business. It is good to talk. Just remember, they're your customers and it is a business, so you need to keep it professional. And I would always say follow-up communication with a text, with a letter, with an email, or a WhatsApp, so you don't have misunderstanding, because that's how things will go wrong with your communication, in my view. So,
okay.
Yeah, I think it's been a good episode, Rachel.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.